Primarily, though, I think what I try and do is focus on my experiences of being there, focus on the friends that I lost. One of the soldiers in my regiment died, he was 18. I was at the National Memorial Arboretum just a couple of weeks ago. It's an amazing place for those who haven't been. I was just sort of stood in front of the wall, just looking at all of the names, and the scale of it is there for all to see. So I do think about it. I think that it shapes my view on the world, and certainly it ensures that if there are debates around the deployment of UK force, I've got that in my mind, and I'm extremely sort of cautious about taking those decisions, as anyone would expect.
Right, it's been 20 years since the beginning of the invasion of Iraq. MPs will be paying tribute to the soldiers who died in Operation Telic in the Commons later on this evening. He'll be led by the Labour MP Dan Jarvis, who's a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan and joins me now. Morning, Dan.
Good morning, Matt.
Remind us of the scale of the sacrifice in Iraq, which obviously began the conflict 20 years ago today.
Yes, 20 years ago this morning, we rolled out of Kuwait and into Iraq. The scale of the sacrifice was enormous. 179 British soldiers who stepped forward to serve in good faith never came home. Thousands were injured. So it feels like an important milestone, and I think it's right that we take the opportunity tonight, not to get in the rights and wrongs of the conflict, but just to think about the human sacrifice and all those families who've been left grieving. So that's what we'll be doing tonight. We're paying tribute to those who stepped forward to serve, but ultimately made the ultimate sacrifice.
How do you feel as a veteran of that conflict, given how controversial it was at the time and what we discovered later, that there were no weapons of mass destruction? How do you feel about it, having been there and served? You know, you don't choose where you go when you're in the army. You go where you're sent. But how do you feel about it now as a veteran?
Well, I suppose I think about it both as a veteran, but also now as an MP. So on three separate occasions in Parliament, I've had to vote to take incredibly difficult decisions about deploying UK military force. So I always have in my mind my own lived experiences of being in Iraq twice, not just in 2003, but then in 2004, and then again on multiple occasions in Afghanistan. I think clearly there is, an ongoing debate about the longer term ramifications of the conflict in Iraq. I completely understand why people want to do that. And of course, I think about it as well. Primarily, though, I think what I try and do is focus on my experiences of being there, focus on the friends that I lost. One of the soldiers in my regiment died, he was 18. I was at the National Memorial Arboretum just a couple of weeks ago. It's an amazing place for those who haven't been. I was just sort of stood in front of the wall, just looking at all of the names, and the scale of it is there for all to see. So I do think about it. I think that it shapes my view on the world, and certainly it ensures that if there are debates around the deployment of UK force, I've got that in my mind, and I'm extremely sort of cautious about taking those decisions, as anyone would expect.
I don't know if you've had a chance to see it today. Our colleague Patrick Maguire's column in the Times today, he notes that when Keir Starmer was running to become Labour leader, he'd, I suppose the words boasted, saying that in 2003 he published a legal opinion in The Guardian that the invasion of Iraq would be unlawful and marched with millions against the war. Today it feels like the anniversary is passing without any comment really from the Labour leadership. There's no plans for Keir Starmer to say anything. Do you think that's a mistake on his part?
I think this milestone has rather crept upon all of us. The truth of the matter is, Matt, we don't talk about Iraq really at all. It feels very much as if it's been brushed under the carpet. We don't really even talk about Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a conflict that was much longer. The scale of loss was much greater. We don't even talk about that. We don't talk about the catastrophic way in which that came to an end and the implications of all of that. So I completely understand why people, for good, sensible reason, don't necessarily want to start unpicking all of that. This is the most sensitive of issues. This is probably the most controversial political decision that's been taken in our country, I guess, since Suez back in the 1950s. And it's very difficult to have an informed, intelligent debate about it. The moment that you put Iraq on social media, there'll be a kind of swarm of people piling in on the back of it. So with that backdrop, I think it is hard to have a kind of meaningful debate about what it actually means for the long term. But by the way, I think we should do that. What I think is particularly important today, though, is we take a moment, and that's what I'll be doing in Parliament at 10 o'clock tonight, to reflect on the service of those steps forward. Whether you think it was the wrong thing or whether you think it was, the right decision that was taken, I